James Pearce, I think we would all agree, is Tennessee's most talented player on defense. Jimmy, any argument with that?
No.
Who needs to step up to help James Pearce? Discussing with some sources yesterday, Keenan Pili, I continue to hear that he is the leader of this defense, and he is viewed as that despite the fact that he's basically played one game. And I could argue he is actually a more important player than James Pearce. What's your contention on comparing those two and the impact they'll have this season?
It's hard for me not to go with Pearce just because I've seen it. I haven't seen it out of Pili. I also saw Pearce make a 52-yard pick six against Iowa. So he showed some versatility there. When I look at the guy that needs to step up, and Pili would be one, but when I look at a great edge rusher on one side, I think you need to have one on the other side because that guy's going to get a lot of opportunities. And I'm wondering if that guy might be Joshua Josephs as a pass rusher on the other side. There's another really good pass rusher that I don't think we talk enough about his ability. It's probably because he's a defensive tackle. But Norman-Lott had, I think, maybe 6 sacks last year. He is by far their best inside pass rusher. And if you can get the pressure up the middle and force the quarterback to scramble one way or the other, I think that's also very important. He's a better pass rusher than Omari Thomas, although Thomas, I would consider him probably the better overall defensive tackle. But what Lott does as a pass rusher, I also think is very important to this defense.
I would add to that, and Caleb, jump in here. Speaking to a source yesterday, look out for Jackson Moya. I think that he is going to be an impact player, the transfer in this fall. So I would include him in all of those names that Jimmy just mentioned. Caleb?
So, Jimmy, it's funny we bring this up because this was actually my big, I don't know if you remember about 11 years ago when Jadeveon Clowney tried to create a Heisman campaign for himself going into 2013. And the argument I always said was, even if a defensive end was ever going to win it, the problem with defensive ends is if you are that elite in a season, typically teams can totally neutralize you by running away from you at that point. So how much pressure is on, you mentioned Joshua Josephs, how much pressure is on all the other edge rushers for somebody to be able to step up on the other side, knowing that teams are going to be running away from James Pearce all year long?
And to add to that, Jimmy, would that have been Tyler Barron, right?
Could have been, yes. Yeah. Here's the other thing, too, to Caleb's point. Not only will you run away from Pearce, but you will also double team him in pass protection. You might have a tackle and a tight end blocking him. You might have a tackle and a running back chipping at him. So you got to have somebody on the other side that puts pressure on the quarterback. And maybe it's Josephs, and maybe it's Maui, the Stanford transfer, Maui. What's his name?
Moa. Yeah.
Moa. It's Moa. No,
Moa, my favorite player.
Boy,
somebody really needs to come through on that other side. I don't think that it's Jackson Rawls, the freshman, but somebody on the other side needs to be a good pass rusher, a productive pass rusher, so that when a quarterback drops back, he doesn't feel comfortable from either end. And so that's why I think it's really important that they develop somebody on the other side, which I think they will. I think they've got enough talented bodies to where they can find another pass rusher to complement from the other side for James Pearce.
15 seconds from Ray Varner Ford, who brings us Jimmy Hyams every Wednesday.
All-wheel drive, $31,954. 24 Ford Edge, all-wheel drive, $37,975. 24 F-250 4x4 Crew Cab, $54,760. Ray Varner Ford, your East Tennessee Ford dealership.
Same source I spoke to when we were discussing how it's summer and players can get in trouble this time of year, Jimmy, and how Tennessee hasn't had a lot of players get in trouble, but the one that did was James Pearce.
Mm-hmm.
And it wasn't just a traffic violation. It was a little more than that. When you don't give police officers respect and you don't follow their direction, that to me is a red flag. It might be a one-off. He might be fine the rest of his life, Jimmy, but how concerned do you think Tennessee should be that James Pearce could have an issue at some point?
I remember when Josh Heupel was asked about Pearce being the number 1 pick in the draft, according to some projections, he talked about now he needs to understand he's got a lot more work to do. I think basically what he was saying is he needs to mature, and that's a part of it. I would think that with Rodney Garner pushing him and with them dangling the carrot, do you want to be a number 1 draft pick? Do you want to make a whole lot of money? Because if you do, you can't be a knucklehead. You can't get arrested. You can't have DUI or whatever. You've got to walk the straight and narrow, and maybe that catches his attention. So, but yeah, he's. I think that maturity is a key word for him to make sure that he continues to work hard to stay out of trouble. It's a little bit of a concern, and look, I don't know all of his background, but I do know that incident raised a red flag with me a little bit. But it's not something that I don't think can be corrected, and not something that they can impart to him to say, look, you could be blowing your future over some silliness like this. So get your act together.
Agree with that. Caleb?
Yeah, I totally agree. And Jimmy, with defensive linemen, I mean, I feel like isn't there the balance of you got to spark a mean streak out of them, but knowing they got to be able to keep a level head when they're off the field? Is defensive line the toughest position to strike that balance on a football field?
Probably, because you're taught to be aggressive, right? As a defensive lineman, probably as much or more so than any other position. So you got to be able to flip the switch. You can be completely aggressive on the field, but you got to be careful off the field. Now, I have seen some offensive linemen that were pretty aggressive, Kate Mays, but I think you just have to be able to strike that balance of leaving it on the field and not carrying it off the field. And I think some players, I think that comes naturally to them. I mean, look at Reggie White. The guy was a minister off the field. So I do think that you can strike that balance. But to your point, you are taught to be aggressive as a defensive lineman. And so I just think that therein comes that maturity part. I don't know, Dave, if you had mentioned this to me a while back, but I read some article about the brain really doesn't mature until you're like 25 years old.
Well, that's what my son told me. That's his
excuse. I remember. Yeah, I think we had that conversation. So in some cases, that brain needs to mature when you're like 20 or 21 if you're a college football player.
Yeah, I think mine matured pretty late, in fact. Okay, so here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to put on the poll question on YouTube. I'm going to change it up just a little bit, Jimmy. So I'm going to say, who is Tennessee's most important defender? Are you going to stick with Keenan Pili because you haven't seen him yet, or James Pearce because of his athletic ability and what you've seen?
I'm going to go with Pearce because I know he can dominate a game. And I'm also intrigued to see how often Tennessee's going to put him in pass coverage. Because I think that pick 6 against Iowa probably upped his draft stock for them to see that athletic ability. So I'm going to go with him because I've seen it. I know what he can do. What did he have, 10 sacks last year? Now, Pili needs to come through. He needs to have a big year for Tennessee at that linebacker position. But I'm going to go with Pearce as the most important defensive player.
And what about you, Caleb?
It's James Pearce. I mean, he's the best defensive player in the country from a talent perspective.
You say it in such a condescending way, like I'm an ignoramus.
It's James Pearce. It's James Pearce.
You were talking.
Oh, hey, what does Peyton think about it?
Like, guys, James, are we not talking about a guy, and from a talent perspective, that's like, in terms of transcendent talent, that's on the Eric Berry, John Henderson, Reggie White level? I mean, Al Wilson level? Are we not talking about that at Tennessee?
Okay. Now, this is going to be out there, but I'm going to say it. They think Keenan Pili can be that type of guy from a middle linebacker standpoint. Now, I'm not saying the outside linebacker like Lawrence Taylor that scares you with big plays. I'm just talking about they think he can be that type of middle linebacker guy, a special middle linebacker. Jimmy, am I being snowed over a little bit?
Well, his brain has matured.
That's very true.
He's a smart guy. Yeah. And I do think he's very important. And he can be a difference maker for this defense. There's no question about it. I didn't think the linebacking core last year was all that good. I did see a linebacker with a lot of tackles, but a lot of those tackles were well beyond the line of scrimmage. I saw linebackers chasing people in pass coverage. I think Peely, if healthy, can upgrade the linebacking position to where it could be one of the most improved positions on the team from last year.
Peely will actually be 26. It's funny. I bumped into him on campus, and he had a briefcase, slacks, and a suit. I mean, he was all dressed up. So old. It's like he was going to work. No, it's like he checks into work every day, Jimmy. I mean, he's 26. I was 26 when I started working. Well, it'd be 26 in the summer. I was 26 when I started working for you.
Did you meet his grandson?
Oh my God. Line of the day.
But also, wait, are you guys honestly telling me that, okay, I get you're saying Keenan Peely is a very smart player. Are you telling me that he has the athletic ability to be that transcendent type of talent?
No. I think he's in the upper 5% of middle linebackers. I think James Pearce is in the upper 1% of all players.
In history.
Is that a better way?
Yeah,
Well,
in Tennessee history.
At least in this group. Is that a fair way to say it, Jimmy?
Yeah. And I understand what you're saying, but and kind of with Pearce, you know what you got. But I go back to my point about Peely is he can upgrade a position that, in my opinion, was not that good last year. That was pretty average. So if you can get a guy that plays at a very high level, not a James Pearce level, but at a very high level at a position that I thought underachieved last year, that makes your whole defense a lot better.
I want to go to the message board. So Keenan Peely at 27 years old is the only player on the team that has matured brain. No more people have a matured brain. If you're going to be good, it might be Peely. If you're going to be great, it has to be Pearce. That's a pretty good comment. Now, I'll ask both of you guys this question. One of those two guys gets hurt in the first game of the season like happened with Peely last year. Which one hurts Tennessee's roster the most?
I'm going to say, and this sounds counter to what I've been talking about, I'm going to say it's Peely.
Yeah.
Because as great as I think Pearce is, and I do think he's a top 10 NFL draft pick, I think Tennessee has more depth at defensive line by far than any position on that football team. So I think there's a greater ability to overcome that with the stacked lineup you have. I mean, Rodney Garner's talking about he's got 10 or 11 guys on the defensive line that can play. How many linebackers can play at a high level? How many?
2.
So, and we got Aaron Carter, who I think is very athletic, but he hadn't proven it. You got Peely. I think there are concerns about if you lose a very good player at a position where I don't think you have much depth, I think his loss could have a greater negative impact on the linebacking core than Pearce would on the defensive line.
Did I win you over with that one, Caleb?
Close, but no, and I'll tell you why. Yes, depth matters. Wait, hold on. Let me just say, and you guys both cover this team. Look, depth matters. Depth matters. I agree with Jimmy on that, and the linebacking core is deeper. So depth is important, but sometimes the talent is so rare it doesn't matter. I'm going to give you guys a great example. In 2001, there were 4 defensive tackles taken in the NFL draft on that roster. John Henderson, Albert Haynesworth, Abreu Franklin, and I believe it was Rashad Moore. All 4 were taken in the NFL draft. And Demetri Ville, you could argue, was a tackle, although he played end. It didn't matter that they were that deep, though. If John Henderson goes down, that's still your biggest loss, right?
No.
Really? You didn't think John Henderson was that important?
No, okay. But here's where I'm going with that. Would Henderson be a huge loss? Absolutely. But what did you have at your linebacking core? You were really good at linebacker then also. So my point is, sometimes even though a player's not as good as another player, his importance at that position could be greater because you don't have depth. Who backs up Keenan Peely at linebacker? Who's it going to be?
I really didn't ask that question. I should have bad reporting skills.
Jeremiah T-Lander?
T-Lander. Okay, yeah, and I think it would be T-Lander. But you've got several defensive ends, not as good as Pearce, but several defensive ends that you can win with at an SEC level. Could you win with T-Lander at an SEC level? I don't know. That's a question mark. So my point is, even though Peely is not as good as Pearce, nobody's arguing that, I'm thinking because of the lack of depth at that position, his loss would be more impactful.
Okay, let me ask this question real quick then, just Dave, if I can do this because all right, I'll play this
By the
game.
way, Jimmy, the guy that holds me so close to the clock is the one that's taking this topic to an extended duration. Go ahead, Caleb.
He's lacking.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
Mostly, he calls me this morning. Quincy had a rough night. Go ahead, Caleb.
He did. He had a really rough night. Okay, so let me throw this in here. Okay. So let's go back to 2001. They were not deep in the secondary that year. They had major issues in the secondary. So would you have rather lost John Henderson or Andre Lott in 2001?
Ooh.
I don't remember that secondary, so don't be going back 20-something years. I haven't slept very well either.
You're older than me, and I remember it.
That's why I can't remember it. If I were younger than you, I'd remember. I don't remember everybody in that 2000.
Sounds like a cop out by Jimmy over here. I think I got him.
I don't know who was in the secondary then.
Willie Miles, Andre Lott, Julian Battle.
Mickey Allen back there?
No, I don't think Mickey Allen was back there. I think that was the 90s.
Yeah.
You said 2001, right?
Yeah, 2001. Andre Lott, Willie Miles, Julian Battle, Rashad Baker, maybe.
Yeah, I think he would have been. He was a receiver that they moved to the secondary.
He was the player that Philip Fulmer came out and said it might be the most natural receiver that I've ever seen in my career, and the next day moved him to the corner. Sorry.